Good afternoon, and thank you, Joseph, and to the team at Exactpro for inviting us to make this presentation. I'm Justyn Trenner. I'm responsible for the research group that we have at QA Media. Just to give you a very brief background on who we are, we undertake specialist events and research in the financial quality assurance space. I have a team of researchers who catalog and get a great deal of background on all of the specialist vendors and consultants, but also undertake specific programs of research to discover attitudes and approaches and opinions. And that's what I'm going to be calling on today. The rest of the information you can see on the screen about myself and my partner, Matthew Crabb, who founded the business. What I'm going to present to you today is based on interviews with about 100 quality assurance professionals, like many of you in the room. In fact, some of you in the room may have contributed, the vast majority of whom are deciders on, choosers of specific vendors and deciders on the process of quality assurance. My own background includes building quantitative trading tools and being part of a management team that prioritized technology projects and gave far too little attention to the whole QA process and gave far too little budget and time and opportunity to get the QA process done, a scenario with which I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar. So what's demanded of the QA teams at financial institutions? Well, put simply, more for less. You're mostly, if you're on the buy side, on the client side of this equation, you're experiencing a pressure on budgets, and that pressure is expected to be realized through improved use of automation, by the magic words agile and DevOps, of which more later, but very undefined. At one of our events, the speaker very nicely summarized DevOps as being rather like teenage sex. Everybody claims to know what it is. Very few people actually do know what it is, and the number who've actually done it is even less. So it seems rather apposite. And automation is a little bit different. Most people do know what that is, but doing it with intelligence is perhaps the next challenge. And just to alarm any vendors here, including our hosts, vendor renegotiation is part of where some of those savings are coming from. But hold fire, because I'm going to give you slightly better news in a moment. Because the other pressure that we are, as a community, under pressure to deliver is, of course, better software sooner, the title of the presentation. The ultimate requirement from QA is we don't want buggy stuff out there, but by the way, we want it yesterday and we want better customer experience. So how do we square that circle? Well, the great news is we start by squaring the circle by throwing a bit more money at the problem. And that money is coming because of competitive pressures. We have to produce software that competes with our competition. There is regulatory pressure, and we've heard a lot about that this morning. And again, those funny words that I mentioned a few moments ago. What's stopping us getting there? Well, from talking to you and to the client-side community, we split the issues into two. I'm going to briefly talk on this slide about the first two, and then in the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to try and get into some examples of the other issues. So the first two issues are enterprise level or strategic. What do we mean by the pressure to innovate? On the one hand, there's the pressure to do perhaps what the ASX has done, which is look at alternative tools and to be seen to be looking at alternative tools. On the other hand, there's the pressure for each individual department to come up with innovation. And that is a problem that then contributes to the second issue, which is business prioritization. Every business is in some level of process transformation at the moment, transformation process. And there is a constant pressure to do my stuff first before your stuff. And I'm going to come back to that issue. But that competing business pressure to get prioritization is a key on a strategic level. If we break that down to a tactical level, then what are the issues that we start to see? Well, we see the detail around innovation and business demands. We also see the detail around regulatory pressures. And Yvette talked us through that a little bit. I'm going to say a bit more about that. And we see the ongoing pressure to deal with multiple legacy systems and legacy fiefdoms. I will come into this in a bit more detail. What does this mean specifically in the world that we're focusing on here today, which is the trading world? Well, quite often prioritization isn't done against a clear business vision. There is not a clear, well-articulated direction of travel for the business as a whole. There's no let-up in regulatory pressures. Data is all over the place, and data is not consistent. I'm sure that just about everybody in this room has had experience of trying to normalize four decimal place data or four significant figure data with another system that has either unlimited or truncates to 2 decimal places, but nobody saw that one coming until you put the two systems together. And of course, the spaghetti of systems and the ownership of the cost to solve these problems, the ownership of the budget being in different fiefdoms. So what do we need to do around clarity of vision and prioritization? Well, the bad news is, of course, and I know I'm telling you to suck eggs in a sense, teaching you to suck eggs, but because every unit wants their changes implemented, you need to have a bigger, clearer strategic vision, which very often those of us in QA aren't quite at the table to effect. But I've certainly been in organizations, and I'm sure many of you have, where the person who has the CEO's ear gets their change done first, or the customer who went out on the golf course with the CEO or with the senior manager last weekend gets their change made first, rather than a clear alignment of requirement for change to the business priority and the business strategy. What also then happens is that the resources associated with testing actually get sucked up into development, get transferred, and you're left with inadequate resources to test. Testing is done poorly, and the activity overload that then hits testing means that you're wasting time doing nice to haves. It would be nicer if this button were green and not blue rather than need to have. If we don't make sure that this process is delivered, we're going to get some bloody great fine for embargo filtering not having actually taken place in this payment system. And that's a real example from at least 3 banks that I can think of as I'm standing here. So resources going to the wrong place. So the solution, not necessarily within control in this room, but the solution is clearly around number 1, clear business prioritization, but number 2, having clear resource allocation. And we see time and again that lack of centralized resource over key parts of testing gets in the way of effective testing. Regulation jumping up apparently at the last minute, and MiFID compliance and also the Dodd-Frank implementation, 2 perfect examples of this where the regulations were being negotiated right up to within a few weeks of them coming into force, which was a great excuse for the businesses to say, we'll sort that out when we actually know what we're meant to be doing, which then meant that actually getting the systems built in time was enough of a challenge, let alone leaving any of you time to test anything. So the need to do scenario-based planning. We've heard a few examples, and in the trading world especially, things like algo testing being put under pressure by the regulators before the algos are put into production use. That's something that we already see. From what the conversations I'm having, I'm seeing the regulators getting more and more interested in the minutiae of testing. And in my experience over the last 20 years, it's interesting how frequently BaFin and before them other German regulators in many ways led the way. They raised the issues in regulation that then became industry-wide issues of regulation, algo being a great example. Well, one of the things that I'm hearing is that I know, and we've done some recent research on this, I know that many financial institutions believe that their contracts cover them to use production data in test systems. It's not at all clear to me that regulators would find that answer acceptable. Maybe their legal contracts cover them, but the regulation around GDPR and other similar sets of regulation won't cover them. So not having your test environment set up in a way that can flexibly adapt to what could be quite last-minute changes in interpretation of regulation is a challenge. And again, I'm going to say allocate more resources centrally, and of course the smart use of automation, all parts of the solution. So coming more specifically onto data. Well, data is often way behind in priorities on the client side. So although there may be central resources for certain functions, in the vast majority of organizations that we've spoken to, test data is the provenance and the challenge of the specific, either the application manager or the application test manager. And that's a huge problem, because the test data that that application test manager needs to use is, of course, going to come from multiple different environments and be in multiple different formats, and also require multiple different levels of expertise. To do a test without doing appropriately dirty data is an inadequate test, as you're all aware. But what is appropriate dirtiness? What's appropriate dirtiness, of course, in market data? It's different appropriate dirtiness in payments data, et cetera, et cetera. So the ability to pull together appropriate frame of test data. Otherwise, we're aware that something like 74% of firms that we speak to claim that they now work on an agile basis, but their data for those tests is not agile, except in about 10% of cases. Moving to DevOps, if your data isn't framed and ready, is just not going to happen. So data needs to be seen not just as a defensive and a compliance requirement, but also as an opportunity. Working across systems, again, an issue that everybody in the room will have had experience of. Particular challenge is that segments of a workflow are available for testing, but a complete integrated workflow with all the latest versions are often not available in a development or test environment. And I've seen this many, many times where the tests that were carried out in the segment that the application manager was responsible for worked just fine, but when it was an end-to-end test, or when the system was put into production end-to-end, it didn't work. And so very often, it comes down to firewall issues and interconnections that just haven't been adequately foreseen and tested. And then this is the slide of shameless self-promotion. What are we looking to contribute to the debate? Well, one of the things that we want to contribute is looking at how effectively vendors and consultants are contributing to that core goal of getting better software to market sooner. So we have taken fairly standard approaches, but we believe combine them in an innovative way to look at the impact, the first two scores, the impact that the vendors have, and then to look at the satisfaction they generate from their clients. By way of an indication, of course, we can break this down by individual system integrators and individual specialist vendors. But by way of an interesting overall overview of the data that we have, we looked at the combination of all consultants and SIs as one group, and the combination of all specialist vendors as another. So Capgemini or Accenture might be represented in the system integrators, and you can probably think of many others, and our friends at Exactpro and others would, of course, be represented in the other. Danger of what I'm presenting, I'm giving you an average of averages. Imagine everybody knows the challenge of that. However, that said, there are a couple of interesting points. In general, system integrators and consultants do work across the whole of the system, the whole of the architecture, and therefore they generate a certain loyalty, but also, I believe that's because they have more control over the entire process and more influence over the process and the thinking around the process. Specialist vendors, you can see from our chart, without any great need to go into detail, seem to have less impact. Of course, there are some who have great impact and some who have less. However, they are prey to one very specific problem, and one anecdote around this will illustrate the problem. There's a vendor that I imagine most of you in this room would know, it's not Exactpro, who was retained about 3 years ago by a very familiar name, a very familiar global bank, and about a year or two later they were let go. They still have a great dialogue, and the specific reason was that the bank concerned never got their proverbial together to be able to exploit and benefit from the vendor. The issues that were blocking getting good value out of the vendor were endogenous to the way that that bank worked. Whereas where you are a broader-based consultant, of course, you may have more influence over that overall process and have more places within the process that you can score points and be successful. And in fact, if we look at the middle of the satisfaction ratings, we find, unsurprisingly, that the specialists are just as expert, and one might argue in their very specific domains, often more expert than the consultants. This is a 2018 set of releases that we'll be doing on the impact of the vendor community on the QA processes of the client side. Our 2019 program that I hope that we'll get to work with some of you on is to actually come up with objective benchmarks for the client side as well, to benchmark the overall process and help identify from an overview perspective the strengths and weaknesses of the way that QA is being implemented against the organization and then being implemented as a discipline in itself. So pulling that together, the first conclusion is really business 101. You need a business strategy. You can't have technology strategy till you have a business strategy, and you can't have a viable testing strategy and testing priorities until you have the technology priorities. You need an enterprise-wide view, not purely a local view, of so much that feeds into testing. You need not just automation, but you need smart automation, which of course means AI and adaptive learning. And again, singing my own song sheet, you need more complete benchmarks to measure whether the vendors you're using and the processes you're using are really making the difference they're intended to make. Thank you. Any questions, any comments?
Yes, thank you, Justyn.
Just on your chart of system integrators against vendors, there was no cost involved in that. I would suggest that the cost of system integrators against vendors would be a multiple of 2 or 3 times. I think it's deceptive to put that out without putting any financial impact on that.
I think that's fair. Actually, it definitely wasn't apparent in the way I presented, but there is a value for money component embedded within that. And you're absolutely right. The devil is in the detail. Thank you.
So, and one question from me. Why your project is named QA Vector 500? Why not 1,000 or 250 or...
Well, to reveal 1 or 2 trade secrets, we decided when we started the project just about a year ago now, actually, we had in our database about 220 specialist vendors in the space. By the end of last year, we had about 380. We had, when we decided how to name it, was 400, and we thought 500 gave us latitude. But it seems like 500 is a number that we can get our heads around.
Thank you. Any more questions to Justyn? No? Okay, thank you, Justyn.
Thank you. Thank you very much.